Unmuted.
Good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, we do not have quorum today, but we will be proceeding with the workshop.
Good evening. We do have text on here to do a presentation on the NEPA and Uniform Act. Ms. Marty Boyd, if you want to come to the podium and start your presentation.
Mayor and City Council, thank you, and thank you for allowing us to come and present to you the NEPA process that our projects have to go through that have federal funds, and also an overview of the Uniform Act. And I want to introduce to you Casey from WSP. He's going to give you a more in detail overview of the NEPA process, and then I'll come in with our Uniform Act. I do want to apologize that our right-of-way folks couldn't make it today, but I'll do my best on delivering the information, and I got lots of brochures that they asked me to leave here with you. Okay, here's Casey.
Good evening. Again, I'm Casey Carlton with WSP, a consultant for TxDOT, and we're going to do a presentation tonight on the NEPA process, and then have some time at the end for questions if there are some. There we go. So really the purpose of this briefing is to gain a high-level understanding of some of the federal compliance requirements of NEPA. We're going to go through the NEPA statute, talk about the NEPA compliance process and the different steps, and then provide some resources for more information at the end. So NEPA, it stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. So this was a federal law signed into law by Richard Nixon on January 1st. And I promise I won't read all the slides, but I do think this is important just to give some context about kind of the intent of the law. So it was to declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere and stimulate the health and welfare of man, to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation, and to establish a Council on Environmental Quality. And the Council on Environmental Quality is the federal agency that was created within the executive branch to actually oversee the implementation of NEPA. It's important to note that NEPA is a procedural law that's governed by the Administrative Procedures Act as opposed to a substantive law, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So again, as I mentioned, NEPA is a procedural law, so it really is a law that requires certain steps in a process to be followed, as opposed to a substantive law that may have legal or fines for noncompliance. This really requires you to go through a process, and if you don't follow that process, someone could bring litigation, which would cause you to have to go back and repeat steps of the process. Really at the heart of NEPA is transparency in the decision-making process. So historically, as you might anticipate, roadway projects might be built. They would just appear in a certain location one day without a lot of background or input from the public as to why that route was selected, why that alternative was selected. So really at the core of NEPA is the disclosure and transparency, especially as it relates to the expenditure of federal dollars. Along those same lines, from a disclosure standpoint, no worries. It requires you to disclose different courses of action to address an issue and then present the impacts and costs. So again, in the context of a transportation project, what are the different options? If there's congestion, for example, is it to expand a roadway? Is it to build a new roadway? Or is it to do nothing? NEPA actually requires you to look at what's called the no build or the no action alternative, which would be what would be the impact of doing nothing versus various courses of action. And probably most importantly, it allows for public comments before decisions are made when there's still an opportunity to actually influence the outcome of the process. What NEPA does not do is necessarily require the selection of the least impactful alternative. It just requires that you go through a rational decision-making process as to how you arrived at whatever solution is the preferred alternative, and then disclose that to the public and allow the public to comment on that process. And one kind of unique nuance to Texas is that TxDOT, as a state agency, has the federal NEPA decision-making authority in this state on behalf of Federal Highway Administration, which is a process that TxDOT applied for and received. So actually TxDOT makes the final NEPA decision on behalf of federal highways. Next slide. Just to give some context to the passage of NEPA and some of the events that sort of led up to it. Again, I would say in general, just a heightened environmental awareness and desire for transparency. So publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson talking about the effects of pesticides in the ecosystem and biosphere. The Santa Barbara oil spill, which at the time was the largest oil spill in history, and actually is still the third largest, only behind the Deepwater Horizon and Exxon Valdez. And the Cuyahoga River fire, which was the river in Ohio that actually caught on fire due to the amount of pollution, made it on the cover of Time magazine. Again, all of this was sort of transpiring before the passage of the law. Included this just to show, again, right around that 1969, 1970 is when NEPA was passed, and then you see a huge uptick in the amount of environmental laws and regulations at that time as well. NEPA a lot of times is called an umbrella law in that a lot of other environmental laws, the ones that I showed on the previous slide, are required to be complied with as part of the NEPA process and the NEPA document that you're preparing. So things like the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Historic Preservation Act, for example. During the NEPA process, you have to demonstrate compliance with all of those other environmental laws as well. So what triggers NEPA? It's really three main things. Federal funding. So if there's $1 of federal funding in a project, it will trigger NEPA. Or if you want to develop a project that could be eligible for future federal funding, you're required to go through the NEPA process. Federal permits. So any federal agency that has to issue a permit must go through NEPA. And then also any federal agency that must make an approval also must go through NEPA. It's important to note that if you do not comply with NEPA, then you risk the eligibility of your project for federal funding, and there can be lawsuits, project delays, et cetera. As far as when the NEPA process takes place, it's really at the early stages of project development, which makes sense because that's really when decisions could be influenced as far as different courses of action. So you can say here, it's really at the preliminary engineering phase, a lot of time called the schematic design phase, that the NEPA process is in place. There's three different classes of action or different sort of compliance pathways within NEPA. Starting at the left of the screen, moving to the right, probably the most time-consuming and most detailed is what's called an environmental impact statement. This is for projects that are really known to have significant environmental impacts. There's a lot of documentation, public outreach requirements related with an environmental impact statement, and the time to complete one of these documents can easily be 3 to 5 years of project development time to go through that process. In the middle is what's called, In the middle is what's called an environmental assessment, which is sort of the mid-level documentation to go through the NEPA process. This is where you're unsure if your project might have significant environmental impacts. And typically this process can take 18 months to 2 years to complete. And then for projects that are relatively minimal, that are known to not have any sort of significant impacts, you can apply what's called a categorical exclusion. This can be, in some cases, a process that can be completed in a couple of months. So it just gives you a sense of, depending on the impacts of the project, the compliance pathway could be from a couple months to multiple years. And significance is really determined based on two factors. The first is the context of the impact. So you can imagine if there's an impact in a pristine wetland, for example, even a small impact could be significant, and then also the intensity of the impact. So it's sort of the balance of the overall intensity of the impact and also the context of where it's occurring. Next slide. The types of resources that are examined during the NEPA process include things like community resources. So this includes things like environmental justice, low income, minority populations, limited English proficiency populations, the impacts of the projects to those groups, water resources, traffic noise, biological resources, so things like threatened and endangered species, air quality, and then also cultural resources, so things like archaeological sites and historic sites as well. Next slide. To give a sense of kind of the overall process, and there's going to be a series of bullets that'll pop up, so yeah, thank you. Really, the first step in the process is going through the advanced funding agreement process. This really must be initiated prior to starting the NEPA process to generate a CSJ and really get the project going. Next is that scoping or class of action determination. So what I mentioned before about a CE, a categorical exclusion, an EA, an environmental assessment, or an EIS, determining which class of action your project will trigger based on the impacts, and then also what technical studies or agency coordination might be needed. Then actually conducting those technical analyses. So there's going to be a series of kind of resource-specific technical reports that document the compliance with those various environmental laws, which may involve a kind of a combination of desktop analyses and then also field studies. Next slide. And then actually preparing the environmental document. So the environmental document is kind of the roll-up of all those individual environmental reports. It will include the agency coordination as well, which may require coordination with external federal agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Corps of Engineers, et cetera. And then once all that process is complete, you receive what's called environmental clearance. And this is really the approval from TxDOT acting as a federal agency to move on with the project. And really throughout this entire process is public involvement, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So public involvement is really critical. As I mentioned before, that was kind of one of the drivers behind passage of NEPA in the first place, was to introduce the ability for the public to have a say before federal actions are taken. Really helps the public and stakeholders stay informed and provide feedback. Meaningful inclusion of stakeholders in the public is important, not just the general public, but also underserved populations. And really the public involvement requirements are tailored based on the type and complexity of the project and the level of concern. So for, let's say, very small, non-impactful projects, the public involvement requirements could be very minimal. For large, impactful projects that may involve right-of-way acquisition, displacements, detours, et cetera, there's typically the requirement to do a lot of public meetings, open houses, one-on-one meetings, et cetera. Next slide. In closing, really the overall approach that's taken throughout the NEPA process is one of what's called avoid, minimize, mitigate. So trying to develop alternatives that avoid impacts if possible. If you can't avoid impacts to these resources, minimize the impacts. And then once impacts are minimized, come up with ways to mitigate any sort of additional impacts. It's important to note again that not following each of these procedural steps could result in delays in the project or jeopardize the eligibility of the project to federal funding in the future. Next slide. We've got some links here with just different resources. Obviously, the TxDOT El Paso District is a great resource for any sort of questions, comments, or assistance necessary to comply with the NEPA process. And there's a variety of different toolkits from both TxDOT and the Federal Highway Administration to assist with some of the more specific details. Those were the only slides I had, so certainly open to any questions, but thank you.
Thank you. I got a quick question.
Yes.
The presentation gives us a bunch of rules, how it works. What would be something or what triggers losing funding? I read when you were presenting, do not comply with NEPA, could.
Right, so there's a lot of different steps in the process as far as sort of which environmental resources you have to look at, which agencies you have to coordinate with based on the complexities of the project in the law, and then within TxDOT's procedures of what they've put in place to adhere to the law. They've got very strict procedures of how to identify different alternatives of action, how to evaluate those alternatives of action against different evaluation metrics, which may involve environmental resource impacts, costs, public input, et cetera. And then ultimately, there's different resource agency coordination requirements as well. So just if those steps aren't followed, someone could bring litigation and which ultimately, if successful, could cause whatever agency that was going through the process to have to go back and redo the process if it wasn't followed. And I guess in the meantime, any sort of federal funding would be in jeopardy at that point.
Thank you.
Sure.
Ms.
Other-
Villalobos?
my question is,
Sure.
I noticed the environment section that you had there. I'm not quite sure, depending on the project, NEPA might, everything might go through paperwork-wise, et cetera, but if there's an environment issue, they might not approve? Is that what I was reading?
Do you know which, was it one of the early slides on
It
there?
was kind of towards the middle end, environment.
The environmental impact statement and environmental assessment? Is that what you're talking
Right,
about?
probably
So
the
it's probably
assessment.
like the third or second?
No, it was further down. It was,
Maybe like the, was it that one?
how about the next one? Yep. Okay, so both of them. I would just say both, because I just saw something that triggered, and then I saw these signs here, and I thought, okay, is this what, they look into this, and then they might not approve the project because of it?
It depends. A lot of times there are, external agency coordination that's required to comply with some of these other laws. So for example, for biological resources, for threatened and endangered species, there's a process with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to kind of go through and ensure your project is not impacting endangered species. If you were to go through that process and not be able to comply with their requirements, then there's a potential your project could not move forward. But typically, there's a process to go through, coordinate with them, try to minimize impacts, and if any impacts are unavoidable, to come up with mitigation measures. So a lot of times, if there's unavoidable impacts, there can, the purchase of additional habitat. With the Corps of Engineers, for example, if you're impacting a wetland, buying into a wetland mitigation bank, establishing a new wetland somewhere else. A lot of times, it's not a deal killer necessarily to have impacts. There is a mitigation pathway. It just may cost money and time to go through that process.
Well, and that's certainly good to know when you're thinking of these projects or, moving forward with NEPA.
Right.
One more question?
Go
And
ahead.
it's probably, you're probably not the right person, but I saw the Disability Act. And so lately I've been, and you're probably not the right person, but I saw that there's a website with tools. If you have like a complaint, for example, my complaint is that lately, when you go, now that I'm a little disabled, when you go to these parkings, the new businesses have the parkings further out for disability, but not in front. How do you correct that, or how, is there so do we go to that website and voice our opinion? There's tools there?
Yeah, and the compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act in the context of NEPA is more so ensuring that all covered groups under the ADA have the opportunity to comment within the NEPA process. So, for example, trying to ensure that we hold public involvement events at locations that don't have the issues that you noted, that have access for all people to get there, that materials are printed in multiple languages, that, there's 508 compliant websites for the visually impaired, things like that throughout the process to try to make sure the disabled are also able to comment on the process, just like everyone else, is more the spirit of it within the context of NEPA.
Okay, great to know. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions?
I have a question. It said about the archaeological process.
Okay.
How do you go about going around that when there's already, is there an acquisition of homes that you need to do, or how do you go about that?
Like if there's going to be impacts to
Like say, for
archaeological sites?
example, there's a bridge and there's homes on either side.
How, specific to like this, relocations of the actual homes based on the project, or like archaeological resources?
Well, do you keep the lots where you're digging, or how does that happen?
Yeah, so typically, so you're saying like how, if you're going to be displacing a house, how you would deal with the archaeological sites that could potentially be under that,
Right.
under that house? I would say that usually doesn't come up because a lot of times if there were archaeological sites. When they actually built the house, they would have probably been uncovered unless they were deeply buried. So they would have been impacted if they were there at that time and no longer be significant because of the destruction that was done at the time of the construction of the house. But typically, just throughout the NEPA process, there's a specific, I guess, to archaeological resources. There's a review of kind of soil types and previous archaeological findings that to try to narrow in areas of high potential for archaeological sites. And they'll actually go and do digs in those areas, shovel tests, sometimes backhoe trenching to see what's out there. And sometimes that can influence the location of the route to avoid archaeological sites, to avoid historic sites, things like that.
Because we do have a lot of historical sites here in Socorro, so I'm just wondering, say there's going to be a bridge coming in, for example, and when you're going through this process, I would guess that you're doing this process of digging through the ground like you mentioned, right? So you just change the location and...
Yeah, that's one of the parts of the alternatives analysis process is to kind of look at multiple routes, and then as you uncover additional information, if you're able to adjust the routes based on either public comment or based on the identification of impacts, that's the intent of the process, is to try to avoid impacts if you can, minimize them if you can't avoid them altogether, and then mitigate if you can't avoid and minimize. And again, sometimes it's a balancing act where there's trade-offs, because maybe if you go one direction, you might impact a historic site. If you widen the other direction, maybe there's a wetland over there. So sometimes there can be kind of trade-offs, and there may not be a kind of a silver bullet that achieves the perfect minimization of impacts. But that's the intent of the law, is to kind of go through that deliberative process, present it to the public so they can see why the decision makers made the decisions they made, and then do all that before the federal money is spent.
Any other questions? No more questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
The shorty one here. Okay, Marty Boyd again. I'm the Director of Advanced Transportation Planning at the district. And, hold on. You got that other presentation? Let's see. There we go. Yeah, and I'm going to be talking to you, just giving you an overview of the Uniform Act. And the next one. And I got to give kudos to Socorro for y'all going, developing your projects on your own and following the federal process. And it's very important that as Casey stated, that we need to make sure that if you have federal funds, you need to follow that federal process on the environmental. And once it is clear, then you can start the right-of-way process and making sure that if you have federal funds, that you follow this process in order to make sure that there's no issues and you're able to acquire the right-of-way that you need for your projects. The purpose of this briefing is just to give you a high overview, and we want to cover the applicability of the compliance of the Uniform Act, and also overview the relocation compliant process, and also have tons of information and resources that you can use. Next one. The Uniform Act also was passed in 1970, same year as the NEPA, and also the primary law related to right-of-way acquisition activities, and establishes a minimum standards related to relocation. It provides a uniform, fair, and equitable treatment of the persons that have property that needs to be acquired, and also ensures that relocation assistance is provided to those affected. Next. What does it apply? Any project that has federal funds, and also you need to acquire real property, and also if there's displacements. If we don't follow these procedures, you also risk the loss of federal funds or project delays or lawsuits. Okay, next one. The Uniform Act covers valuation, acquisition and negotiation, and relocation and assistance. During the evaluation, if you want to go to the next one, yeah. It covers the appraisal, which must occur before any negotiations and can be waived for donations or properties under $10,000. The review, we ensure that requirements are met, seek corrections, and recommend for use. And then the just compensation, these are the appraisals that provide minimum offer, and then another higher offer negotiations can be made that reflect the actual circumstances. Okay, next one. The acquisition and negotiations, this is when we contact and give the first offer. And in your case, if you're doing the acquisition, Socorro will go out there, but you need to follow this process like we do. You can make the personal contact to explain the process and also give a prompt written offer to the property owner. Then the owner's consideration is next, where they're giving an opportunity to consider the offer and also can negotiate, make other suggestions or modifications. And we must consider the owner's presentation. You've got 90 days notice and then the purchase. 90-day notice for displaced owners and tenants. An owner cannot be required to surrender property until they're paid. If an agreement can be reached through negotiation, this is where you use the eminent domain process when you go to court. Relocation assistance covers relocation plan, also has advisory services, and also assistance for payments. On the relocation, it applies to housing and businesses. It considers the size, the price, the location, and the timing, and also considers unique requirements of business and the persons in them. Advisory services provides information, counseling, and advice, and minimize hardship, additional assistance for people with special needs, as you were mentioning. Assistance with payments on residential moving, expenses, and change in price or rent and housing. Businesses, additional payments available to reestablish your business on your new location. Okay. We do have some pamphlets to give you. These are available to you, and we're also providing the links. The next. And we have training with Federal Highway. This is free, and you can take it. There's the link. It's about 6 hours, so I'm giving you the little version. But this is excellent, and that way anybody with your projects, it'll be great to provide for the rest of the city council members and your city personnel. Okay, next. We have an excellent team of right-of-way agents at the district. They're just down the road from you. Ismael Hernandez, he's a right-of-way manager. Arceli Olmos, and Silvia Ontiveros and Silvia Garcia. They're at your disposal. Give them a call if you have any questions. And they apologize for not being able to be here to answer any more questions, because if you ask me any questions, I'm going to have to refer to them. Okay. All right. Next one. I'll refer to them. But I do I give them to you, Adriana? Yeah, and then these are extra brochures that we have. And we wanted to also provide you a little quick presentation on invoicing that Claudia has from our local government office.
Before you jump into that, can I ask a question over your presentation? Sure.
I hope I can answer. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, I noticed the 90 days.
Uh-huh.
Typically, that's not how long it takes to.
No, that's, I think, the max,
It is
the
the
limit.
max, 90
yeah.
days. But for them to find another place?
I think that goes through the negotiations and the relocation. I think is the 90 days just to finalize, once the offer is approved, to finalize the movement and everything else.
Okay, but that's not, you have to get out in 90 days, period, you know?
No,
Okay.
no.
Gotcha, because
Yeah.
I know it doesn't, it takes a
No,
lot
it takes a long time to prepare the appraisals and then go with the offers, the negotiations,
Yes, ma'am.
and so forth.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. There any more questions that I can't answer?
That was easy.
All right, that was easy. Yeah, there you go. Okay, and I have Claudia Moreno, and she's going to talk to you about invoicing.
Good afternoon. My name is Claudia Moreno. I work at Texas Department of Transportation and the Advanced and Transportation Planning Department as a contract specialist. And today we're going to go over the invoicing process. And I apologize if I don't look completely to the screen since my vision is not really good at this age. So we're going to go over quite a few steps that we're going to cover through invoicing, such as format, emails, invoice review, current projects, report review, and invoice timeline. The first step we'll go over is the format. All invoices must be submitted on PDF format. Everything must be combined, such as reports, receipts, just in one file. The file name must be identified by invoice, number, project name, and CSJ number. Invoice number, project name, and CSJ name. Invoice mailbox. All invoices must be sent to ELP, contracts@texdot.gov. Every single invoice must be submitted to the mailbox for TxDOT, CC the project manager, and project manager supervisor. The subject line for the email must be the same as your file name, that is your project number, your invoice number, CSJ number, and name of the project. The body of the email will be repetitive as well. You have to mention the same as you submitted. Every single invoice must be submitted just in one email. If you have three invoices, every single invoice must be submitted in a different email address. Invoice review. As you can see on the screen, we have set up an example as an invoice. Everything has to be, must be submitted on letterhead, invoice date. Make sure you issue the invoice to the project manager's name. Reference the project and CSJ number, invoice number, invoice amount, service dates, and always make sure you submit it with an authorized signature. Currently, TxDOT has 4 projects with the city of Socorro, in which we have the 2 bridge contracts. The project manager is Mr. Siltai Soto. In this case, when you submit the invoice for those 2 specific projects, you don't need to CC the supervisor since Mr. Soto is a supervisor. For the other 2 projects, there are the Arterial 1 and Nuevo Hueco tanks, is Mr. Sal Alonso, and his supervisor is Mr. Chito Patel. So you have to make sure you CC both when you submit those 2 invoices. When we look for the report review, we always check the CSJ number, project name, invoice number must be included on the reports. Service date should be correspond with the invoice, with other reports such as subcontractors and consultants. Complete names on classifications and numbers of hours that are being billed must be clear. For example, if we have the name of a person that is on the report is JCG, MTZ, will not be permitted. Everything must be as Jacinta Guadalupe Martinez, as it shows on the driver license or social security number. Everything has to be clear as their legal number, legal name. Classification and the number of hours being billed for that specific person. All rates must match classification in the work authorization. Subtotals of each consultant must be concise with the invoice of the total. If direct expenses are billed, make sure you don't include any tips. As you can see on an example for one of the invoices for the city of Socorro, we have the name of the project manager, project name, CSJ number, invoice number, service dates, and the name of the consultant as well with the amount billed. Next. Expenses cannot be more of the amount payable as is in the contract stipulated. If the timesheets are included, the project number must be included on the timesheets. If no timesheets are included, you have to make sure the signature of the project manager it's on the report. The total bill today must not exceed the obligated FPAA. Something that is kind of critical as well, when you submit an invoice, for example, for 3 months, it can be July, August, and September, you have to make sure you split it up those. No fiscal year cannot overlap. So if you submit invoice for reference July and August for the service, you can name it invoice 19-1, and for the month of September can be 19-2. As you can see, this is one of your examples of one of your reports. Everything, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is the project name, CSJ number, consultant's name, name of employee, classification, hours billed, and amount. If in the detailed report, it's the same as well, the CSJ number and name of employee. This is another report as of your consultants. In this case, we have an invoice total issued to the city of Socorro. We have this, the name of the project. There's no CSJ number, so I will recommend to add it. Talk to your consultants and mention to add it as well, the CSJ number, and we have the service dates. Typical review timeline for invoices. Currently, we don't have any scheduled dates for the city of Socorro. Invoices can be submitted within the 1st, the 10th, of the 15th of each month. We will recommend from now on, if it's possible, we only have 4 projects, so if it's possible, if you can submit your invoices at the same time, that will help us with the process. So if you submit invoice for 423, for the 4 different CSJ's numbers, if you plan to submit it at the same, like on the 15th, on the 10th, make sure you submit the 4 invoices. That will be a good recommendation to accelerate the process. So the process that we have is between day 1 and 7. We receive the email through the inbox of TxDOT. Currently, I'm your point of contact for invoices, Claudia Moreno. I will review the invoice, make any comments, and forward those to the project manager. Next. Between days 7 and 14, the project managers review the invoice and approves them. In this case, if he rejects the invoice, we go back again. I send it back to you. You will review it and submit it, and the clock starts again. We will use that day of the revised invoice, not the original invoice date. Between day 14 and 20, contract specialist, in this case myself, will process the receipt in PeopleSoft or OnBase and continue the process and send that to finance. Between day 21 and 28, finance will review the invoice, make sure the reports and invoice amounts match, and then send it to the Texas Controller Office. Between day 28 and 30, the Texas Controller received the voucher and process payment. Currently, your point of contacts for invoices is myself, Claudia Moreno. We have as a backup for invoices, we have Mr. Brandon Williams. The team lead is Mr. Rebecca Becky Reyes, and we have Supervisor Marty Boyd. That concludes my presentation. Do you have any questions?
I didn't read it. What did Santa Claus say? Was it Santa Claus? You did.
Yes.
All right. There you go.
That's the auditor.
Got it. Cute. All right.
Do you have any questions? No? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, I just want to thank you again for having us, and any questions you have on the environmental process, we're here for you. Again, with the right-of-way, I gave you the contacts, and the invoicing, I think that's been going on a lot better now, I think, and for future. And I do give you kudos for developing your projects and getting ahead. Now, hopefully, Arterial 1 and Nuevo Waco tanks will keep going, and there's so much work to do, so. And again, we're the overseers of the federal funds, so we're here to help you and get it done. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, for coming out. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. We always appreciate TechStop support. You pretty much has walked us through the process, and we do appreciate that. You know, without you, we wouldn't be able to fulfill these projects, so
And
thank you.
Anytime, Becky Reyes, she's our lead for our local governments up there. And she's also developed some training for the project development process. And it has to be constant, so anytime you
Yes.
need it, we'll do it again. We have WSP with Casey as an extension of our office. And for anything environmental, even with local government process, we'll do. And I want to introduce while I'm out here, my
Yes.
environmental team. I'm so proud of them. There's 4 of them. We got Roger Williams, she's the lead, and Ismael, Adrian, and Alexia, our new ones. So those are the faces you're going to be seeing on reviewing your environmental process with your projects. And
Yes.
where's I'm
Thank you.
missing Gus? Gus is one of our planners, and he's here. You met Claudia? And WSP, Blanca now is part of WSP, which we're so happy to have her because we're lost sometimes without her.
I
Anyways,
know. But no, thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
you.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that is the end of our presentation tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good evening.